how to grow medicinal species, so that will be quite short. But then what to do with those, with your harvest, how to extract, and then how to produce something, if you're interested in producing a finished product, medicinal herbal product, what that entails. I imagine a lot of you are already growing, so we're going to spend quite a bit of time on that, but not the whole talk, so it's not going to all be about that. It's going to be about the process from start to finish, medicinal plants, and where they sit also as a sector in nutraceuticals, pharmaceuticals, and also in the food sector. So I trained as a pharmacist like 10 years ago in Bath. After that, I went and apprenticed as a medical herbalist around the UK and then also in the US. And then I practiced that for a bit, and I started to grow medicinal. If you've seen the introduction, mentions Trill Farm. So I was growing medicinal plants and part of a small company there in the US, and then I came back to the UK and did the same thing for Trill Farm down in Dorset, Lyme Regis. And then I went to Hungary and started to grow in a small agroforestry type system. So implementing what I'd learned and then trying to synthesize it into an agroforestry system. So I'll touch on that as well, since it's in the description here. After that, I've just come back from Sweden last year, and I finished my Masters in Forest Ecology and Sustainable Forest Management, and then did my thesis in medicinal mycology, so looking at medicinal properties of chaga and optimizing the growth of chaga. And we can talk about that. We'll touch on that. Not a lot. We don't have a lot of time, so there's a lot of things to touch on. We don't have a lot of time, but I'll touch briefly on my research with chaga in Sweden because it nicely highlights some of the issues with growing medicinal species for quantity versus quality. So we'll come to that. Yeah. So you don't have to be a scientist or scientifically trained or pharmacist to grow medicinal plants. You don't need that background, but it does help, and it has helped me to understand where bioactive constituents sit within a plant. So different parts of the plant, they're not all active in the same way, or if at all. So it's important to know that if you're growing a medicinal plant and you plan to, you're interested in it being used optimally, then you want to know which part of the plant contains the highest concentration or any at all of bioactive constituents. I said a lot of words. So a bioactive excuse me. So a bioactive constituent is a known chemical compound that has a known biological activity in the body. So we can take an example. We can take lavender, for example, and the essential oil of lavender contains small molecules, small compounds that have a certain effect on the central nervous system, for example. That we tested, that we studied, and we know that. So when we're harvesting the flower heads of lavender, we're not looking to really harvest the stalk, for example, or the root even. If that makes sense. So I'll give a good example of when I made a really good mistake. This is like 10 years ago, I was harvesting, I saw a herbalist, or perhaps I read it in a book, harvesting calendula, so marigolds, calendula officinalis. There's some just on this little ridge behind these tents, if you don't know the plant. Small orange, very brightly coloured flower. It's an annual plant in this zone. But the compounds responsible for the colouring in the petals it's carotenoids, so it's the same as what makes carrots colourful, orange. But the active compound responsible for its medicinal activity externally. So it's used for eczema. You know, it's the resin is extracted in an oil, and it's used for eczematous conditions, so inflammatory skin conditions. So I saw a herbalist harvest it, put it in oil, which you can all do. You dry it, put it in oil, let it sit for a bit. In a couple of weeks, you've got this. It's basically an extract in oil. So I did it myself. It's a long time ago, but I did it myself, and I was plucking the petals off the flower, plucking the petals off the flower, and filling up a bowl full of petals. And should we just get rid of this blue screen? Yes. Ghost. We can just, yeah. Perfect, thank you. So I was plucking these petals, and I soaked them in oil, and sure enough, the carotenoid pigment came out into the oil. And usually I do use that as an indicator. It's a proxy indicator of the potency of that. So the darker orange it is, I usually know that that's a good. Now I know that it's a really good indicator of how much calendula was used per oil, for example. And we'll go into that later in terms of processing. But interestingly, it's the underside, under the calyx, where the resinous drops are found. So if you ever pick, if you picked, I've picked a lot of calendula, eventually after maybe 10-15 minutes your hands start to get resinous and sticky. And it's nothing to do with the petals, it's to do with the resin on the underside of the flower, what we call the calyx. So by picking petals and putting them in the thing and creating that little extract, it's got a nice orange oil, and technically it's a calendula extract, but it doesn't necessarily contain the known active constituents, which had actually been found on the flower head, underneath the flower head. I should really have some to show you. Does that make sense? Yeah. Does anyone have any questions about that, or something to clarify from that? That didn't make sense. So what I mean to say is, before you start thinking about growing medicinal plants, it's very useful to know what it is that you're going to harvest, and why, and how. So that's a useful thing to know in your mind. There are lots of medicinal plants that we can grow in this country. Some of them are annual, a lot of them are perennial, and a lot of them will spread, and they're quite good at suckering and taking care of themselves. The reason for that is, the reason why they take less effort than domesticated vegetables is exactly because these have been domesticated. So they are not necessarily well adapted to the space they grow in. We've optimized a certain characteristic of the plant. For example, we want the pumpkin to get bigger, not necessarily better at taking up a specific nutrient or something like that. So by selecting over generations and generations, we make slightly more difficult plants to grow, although they produce something more desirable, perhaps. But by and large, medicinal species, they're more related to the wild strain. There is some selection, of course, there is selection for more potent medicinal activity, but not as much as domesticated vegetables and fruit, for example, apple trees. So they're actually they're a little bit easier to grow, and you've probably all had that experience. Mint is a great example. Mint, there are lots of varieties of mint, so it gets a little bit more nuanced, but still, you could all successfully grow mint in most soil types. I will give you just maybe 10 species, which I think for a beginning, to begin with, you probably won't go wrong with. It depends on the soil, it depends, of course, how successful you will be will depend on the soil. But more or less, mint, calendula, marshmallow, tell me to slow if I'm going too fast, elecampane, roses, so Rosa rugosa, so the more wild type, or you can also grow the Damascena rose, damask rose, if you're interested. Sage, rosemary, thyme, lavender, so those all come together, and bay, I would say. So those, the last 5 all require very or more sandy soil because they're a Mediterranean species, so they don't like to be waterlogged, otherwise they get infected. So you want to amend the soil for those last 5. Yeah, so if you've got those going at a large enough scale, you've got quite a lot of medicinal plant material quite readily available. So now it depends on what you want to do with it. What market are you trying to enter into? Are you trying to enter a food market? Are you trying to process this herb further, which is what I was doing? Or are you going to sell it just in bulk, more or less, to a supplier at a restaurant, for example? So at Trill Farm, we were growing some Mediterranean herbs to sell to the restaurant, but also we were selling teas. So we would grow blue mallow, which is a little bit similar to marshmallow. It's Malva kind of family. Now we're growing calendula, lemon balm, Melissa officinalis. Actually, you can add that to the list, that first list. So yes. Elecampaign, yes, Inula helenium. So Elecampaign is a really nice one. I don't know if you know Organic Herb Trading Company, but they have a really nice lot of Elecampaign. I've just used that for my chest, so that contains. I'm going to avoid doing what I'm about to do, which is go into specific technical aspects of a particular herb, because I think we're interested in growing them and not necessarily a herbalist course. But this particular one I just used, and it's got an essential oil in the root, and it's antibacterial, and it's very, very healing. And it contains inulin, which is an undigestible polysaccharide in the root. So that's hence the Latin Inula helenium. But that's a really nice plant, and it's a really beautiful and big, and then that brings us on to what kind of spread it will have, and how would you grow it in combination with other species, for example. So just to track back, what are you going to use these plants for? I think it's a key question to ask, because at Trill Farm we grew lots of things for tea, and really, really high quality artisanal tea, really expertly grown. I can tell I was growing it, but should you say so? Yeah, it was good. It was good stuff. So well grown, and then harvested and dried. So generally speaking, if you're drying a herbal product, the raw material, you're trying to get it to below 10%, 10%, something like that. Perhaps a little bit more in roots, but definitely not more than 15%. So ideally lower than 10%. If it's more than that, and you're drying it, then there's something with the process of drying. So we can talk about that as well a little bit later. So you need to know what you're going to do with it. So we were growing for tea, lots of different plants, lots of different things. So grown a lot of it from seed, some of it perennial, harvested at the optimal time, where the medicinal constituents we assume would be the highest. So an example of that, we don't have a lot of time, but an example of that is harvesting plants with essential oils in them, just after the dew has evaporated, but not too far later in the day, because the essential oils will have evaporated off, because they're quite volatile. So the essential oils are not chemically speaking, they're not actually oils. They're very small molecule compounds. They're with a low molecular weight, which means that they're volatile, and that means any amount of heat or light and then heat will drive them off and reduce the quality of your material considerably. So harvesting, so that's an example of what I was saying earlier also about knowing where your medicinally active constituents are sitting, and I suppose it's more what I'd like for you to take away is how to think about it, not necessarily all the technical information, but just how to think. So you're really thinking about I think about it on a chemical level. You can think also about it on an energetic level. So if there's an essential oil containing plant, you'll smell it. So you'll know that it's smelling, and you know that Sorry. So you know that if you can smell something, so you can just imagine the vapors. You can imagine that in midday in the summer, that's going to be taken away. So you can think about it in different ways, but just be mindful. So, what was I saying? Yes. So, how you process, when you harvest them. Okay, so that's, you got to try and think about when the optimal time for harvesting. Harvesting flowers when they appear and they're the most vibrant. That's just a general rule. So spring, summer. Leaves, summer. And then there's biodynamic concepts around this, which we won't go into. Roots in the autumn, winter, like any other root crop. So when the energetics of the plant has descended down to the roots, and then seeds when they appear and they're fully ripe. So, for example, like rosehip, for example, if you wanted to take that and harvest that, it needs to be in the autumn. So there's different times for doing that. So let's go back to Elecampane. Elecampane has this beautiful, bright yellow flower. That's not what we want to harvest. We want to harvest the root. So we need to wait for that. So I need to plan for that harvest. So you're going to dig up Elecampane. It is a perennial, so you could perhaps just harvest the radial roots and leave the rest of the plant in the ground for the next year. And they go quite far and they get quite thick, so you could harvest like that. And then different things you need to think about. So there's essential oil in that root. How do I then dry it? So if you're harvesting lemon balm leaves, and you need to dry it, you need to take off the moisture to get it to below 10%. But at the same time, you want to preserve the essential oil fraction, because that's what's responsible for the medicinal activity. So it's a very delicate balance then, because I know that if I dry it at a high temperature, 70, 80 degrees, I get the water off quickly, but then I will have compromised the product. So it's always a balance with these things. They all have different growing habits. So the mint family, they're all perennial. The calendula, we resow, or we encourage their self-seeding. So that's an annual plant, so you'll need to collect seed for that and then resow it the following year. Just being aware of their growing habit and what you can rely on to come back the next year without you having to resow it, and also what can you propagate. So you could propagate in the winter sage, lavender, rosemary, all these things. You can propagate marshmallow and Elecampane by root cuttings and taking it and dividing the plant up like that. So understanding the plant that you're working with, I think is the essence of what I'm here to say, really. So what's the medicinal activity of the plant? Where do you plan to put it? How do you plan to harvest it optimally to preserve its medicinal activity? And then how do you process it? I've said a lot, and there's a lot to say. I'm trying to pick examples of how this process works. So it's a little bit all over the place. But are there any questions from what I've just said now that come up before perhaps we go on to processing? No? Okay. 10 minutes. Yeah. Okay. Right. Wow. So when you process medicinal plant, again we're talking about drying. So you can either dry the plant, so let's just imagine you've got mint, you've got loads of mint. You've cut it now at wherever you've cut it. You're either drying it on the stalk, or you've taken the leaves off and you're drying it that way. You can dry it, and then that can be part of a tea. So you have dried mint. That's a thing. Or you can put things as a blend, as a tea blend, or you can put things in oil and allow the essential. So that's true for essential oil compound. containing plants. You can put them in an oil, and the essential oils go into the oil, basically. You wouldn't put wet plants into oil, so that's a really good thing to know from the beginning. So you don't put wet plants to extract in oil, generally speaking. You can under certain circumstances, but you generally don't do that because you don't want water in your finished oil. I think it's self-explanatory. You can also then make tinctures. So if you're going to make a tincture in alcohol, you can use the wet plant, and a lot of people do. So you take the wet plant and you put it in, for a wet plant, the volume or the weight is much higher. So you need a lot more wet plant to make an extract in anything than you do a dry plant. So when you dry something, this will probably put most of you off growing medicinal plants, knowing that you got all of this plant material and it dries to that weight, but it's quite potent. But it's still a very small weight, and then how to make that valuable. So for me, it's really important. If you don't know a herbalist, or if you don't know someone inclined to add a process to basically add value to your product, then get in touch with someone who can do that for you. Because selling dried herbs is quite difficult. It's quite a challenge because you've got such a small quantity. So unless you have a very large area to grow quite a lot of fresh material, and then a large processing area to dry it into, you see what I'm trying to say. So if you know how to extract what you do have and actually add value in that way, and you understand the processes, then that's a good way of going about it. So I'll quickly touch on my research in Sweden, because I imagine we don't have too much more time. So the research in Sweden was growing chaga, which is a medicinal fungi. So I was tasked with optimizing the growth of chaga in laboratory conditions, so in vitro. Now the team there asked me to grow it to find the fastest growing strain. So we want to find the fastest growing strain of chaga. This is a mycelium, a parasitic mycelium. So that's talking about primary metabolism. Primary metabolites are carbohydrates, fats and lipids. Usually it's the secondary metabolites which are responsible for medicinal activity. So essential oils are examples of secondary metabolites. A lot of terpenes and tannins and all these other very interesting compounds, phenolic compounds, that are responsible for medicinal activity in the plants that you plan to grow. They're all termed secondary metabolites because it's only after the plant has established itself, primarily lipids, fats, proteins, etc., can it then start to synthesize biochemically other more interesting plants which are used for defense, which are used as chemoattractants for pollination or whatever it is. So when we're talking about secondary metabolites, we're talking about a process that is excess to survival. So anyway, in Sweden, they wanted me to find the fastest growing strain of chaga, which they would then patent and then sell to foresters. So, well, perhaps they wouldn't patent it, actually. That was a discussion. But it was important to know that as you grow a faster strain, the quality doesn't decrease. So how do you test for that? So what we're looking at is do primary metabolites and focusing on prioritizing primary metabolite production. Does that have an effect on secondary metabolite synthesis? So what we did is we looked at the fastest growing strains across different variables, so temperature, media, and then strains. Different types of media, different types of temperature, different temperatures. And then what we saw was, so we were looking at one of the known bioactive constituents in chaga, which are the melanins. So there's pigmented, quite easy to assess. And so we looked at that and looked at whether the fastest growing chaga, and this is true for all the medicinal species that we're talking about, whether the fastest growing chaga, mycelium, was compromised in its secondary metabolite synthesis, which was the melanins. And we did see that, although it was not statistically significant, we needed a larger sample size to demonstrate it. What we saw was that the slowest growing chaga mycelium actually had usually a higher pigmentation, and the fastest growing chaga, the fastest growing mycelium, had least pigmentation, although that wasn't consistent throughout all the media and all the temperatures. We did notice this. So for me, firstly, as a man of science, or somewhat, we try to stay a little bit conservative about the findings and say a larger study needs to be done. So firstly, a larger study needs to be done. But significantly, if you push an organism to grow at its fastest, it usually doesn't have time to assimilate and biosynthesize the compounds that it's necessary to perform optimally. And it's usually those compounds that, when we imbibe them, are medicinally active and useful. So I'm going to stop there. I think I said a lot of things. So yeah, I'll just mention. Okay, so this is an example of a product that I've made, multiple herbs, multiple things in it, and it's an example of adding value to something based on technical knowledge. And so if you can have that in your mind, that if I'm growing this, perhaps it doesn't end there. Perhaps I could add a process, or make an extract and sell the extract. And work with it like that, then you can add value to your enterprise. So this is a cola tonic that I make with mushrooms and different things like that. If you're interested, you can come and have a look. And I'm going to be selling it on the stall over there, at Jackie's stall, at the cafe. So if you're interested to know what it takes to do that in more detail than what we've discussed, then we can do that. I think I'm going to stop there. Up for questions though. Yeah, so.
Yeah, hi. I remember when I first started growing, I was put in charge of the starting up the herb garden at Trill, and so it was really funny. And so I knew nothing at the time, but I loved it. And what we did was we ended up taking all the herbs and putting them, I don't know if it's in the same place, in a sort of a dark room with a dehumidifier.
Yeah.
With different, I think it was kind of net trays.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering if you had any good kind of, if anything had progressed, or if there are any good hacks for sort of drying herbs quickly and keeping their active constituents there and stable.
Yeah, that's a great question. So if everybody heard that correctly, at Trill we had a little room. So moisture comes off the plants, and then we were using a dehumidifier. This was a long time ago that I was there also.
Yeah.
But you use a dehumidifier to take moisture out of the room and then re-establish a gradient, right? You're re-establishing that gradient so that the water can move back into the air and it's not saturated anymore. So anything that would increase that gradient between the moist herb and the dry air is going to speed that up. So if we had a pump at Trill pumping out that air, that would have been an improvement already. If we had 2 dehumidifiers, that would have been an improvement. If we had more surface area and better airing between those things, that would have been an improvement.
Yeah.
So rather than give you the answer, because there are so many ways that an appropriate technology can be employed here, just trying to make you think okay, what is actually the process occurring? This is wet. We need a gradient between the wet herb and the dry air. We know that moisture is driven off by heat, and it will follow a certain gradient from high concentration to low. All that business. So a pump, dehumidifier, as much surface area and airflow through those layers as you can. And then there's something to say about heat as well, adding heat. So no heat was added in that system, and they could have been. And then you need to find that if you can regulate that heat, because you don't want it to be too high, you need to know what temperature you're drying it at, basically. But great, that's a really great question, and I think that's a big limiting step for most grows, especially when it comes to roots, because roots really hold a lot of water. So that's a really good question.
Thank you.
Say if I'm wanting to grow 2 to 5 milligrams,
Yeah, great question. This is an analytical chemistry domain question. So firstly, you need to know what those compounds are that you're looking for, and the issue with that is that there are hundreds responsible. So you need to choose one. It could be anything. So let's say you've got turmeric and you're trying to look for the curcuminoids as a whole family of compounds in there, and then you're looking for one of them, curcumin, let's say, and then you want to take that and say, can you test for this? What concentration would be between 2 and 5%, and then you can grade your herb based on that. And so each time you put it in, you can send it off. You can send off samples. Is the answer to chemists, but you need to be informed as to what they're looking for, because they will have a library. So they have a monograph and they have a whole library of compounds that they can see, and you need to tell them, I'm looking for that peak there, and then they'll tell you that's the concentration of that compound at that peak, and that's how it works. But that's a whole different lecture. We're talking about libraries of compounds and why we choose one constituent to standardise a particular extract to. So yeah, and herbalists themselves are limited in that knowledge because there's just so many compounds in any one given plant that contributes to its effectiveness. So perhaps you want to look at, I don't know, if you've got meadowsweet, what's the concentration of salicylates? Or is it just salicin that you're looking for? So is it the family of compounds, is it one compound? And then also the tannins, because they're also implicated in its medicinal activity. So you need to be aware as a grower and a supplier which compounds you would like to be tested and how they are an indication of the therapeutic effectiveness. Does that make sense? Yeah. So I don't know, the sweet spot would depend on so many variables, but I would say probably between 40 to 50 degrees. That's what I usually dry my things at. Things like lemon balm or rose, I would be inclined to dry them at a lower temperature, just because they're so delicate, and I don't want to drive off the essential oils. But and then in roots maybe a little bit higher, but something between that range. Yeah. And there are so many variables depending on the ambient temperature around, depending on how wet they were, how they were harvested, which part of the plant it was, what the plant is. So around there, So different oils have different qualities, yeah, for sure, and they have their own inherent activity. So coconut oil has its own antibacterial activity, so does olive oil, where rapeseed oil doesn't necessarily have that, or sunflower oil don't necessarily have those things like caprylic acids and different acids that are present in those oils that aren't present in others. It depends what you're going to do with the oil also. By and large, if you're just starting out, it doesn't really matter. Yeah, I'm going to say that. By and large, it doesn't really matter. I'm remembering, just trying to activate. This is supposed to be an activating talk, not a. So yeah, just go for it. Good for you. Anything else? We're going to go here and then there. Exactly. Yeah. So So I would say it depends. If I knew you, so I'd send you to one place, and I'd send you to a different place, and I'd send you to a different place. I would, because it's not. You're not all the same person, and herbalism can come at so many different angles. So you can work at it from a folkloric perspective. You can come at it from a chemical perspective. You can come at it from so many different angles. From even like a power plant perspective that has lots of other astrological implications and things like this. So it depends what you want to do with the plants. So if you wanted to I want to make some things to use for my kids or for my local community, and I want to know the practical aspects of it, I'd send you in one direction. I'd send you to James Green's The Medicine Maker's Handbook. If you want to know the chemical constituents and how they are active in the human body, I'd send you to David Hoffman's Medical Herbalism book. If you wanted to know, so it depends. But we can come and discuss afterwards if you like, and say, I'm interested in this, I'd like to come at it from this. If you're interested in the folklore and how that worked, then Matthew Wood, the wisdom, I can't remember the name of that book, Herbal Wisdom I think it's called, but his name's Matthew Wood. He's an American herbalist, he's brilliant. So lots of different ways of coming at it, and I think that's what I started the talk with, like you don't need to have a scientific background, but it does help to have a stance. It does help to have a stance. You don't have to have that, you can have a different stance and still be an effective practitioner. So that's what I'd say about that, but feel free to come and discuss. Any other questions? Oh, yes, you have, yeah. Was it the same question? Yeah. So I practiced for a while, and I've got a little library now of different books, and I think it's healthy to challenge yourself. If you find like these chemical structures are all a bit scary, then I would challenge you to just go look through it, have a general idea of what those chemical pictures even mean. You know, it's a whole language, so just challenge yourself in each time. If you feel like a little bit more like you want to stay with the theory and not with the practical, then get the book that's more practical and get a little bit like stuck in. I think I can be a little bit like that, and like I need to know lots and lots of things before I do something, and I think it's a really good thing to just go and jump in and try and not think too much about it also. But then you need to think more and more as you go, especially if you're treating other people. So I'm going to actually just add this in. If you're responsible for treating other people or even yourself, it's very important that you have a good amount of knowledge before you do that, because it can be quite dangerous. Some plants you can misidentify. Some plants you can extract incorrectly or perhaps with a dangerous solvent. So there's lots of things that can go wrong. Generally, it's going to go right, but you need to also take responsibility for that. I'm just going to add that in. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah. All right. We'll stop there.